On a spring afternoon in the year 2005, inside a federal courthouse in Brooklyn, an old man in a gray tracksuit sat down across a table from a prosecutor and did something no boss of a New York crime family had ever done before. He agreed to become an informant. Not a soldier flipping to save himself from a short prison term, not an associate looking to settle a grudge, but the boss himself, the man at the very top of the Bonanno crime family, one of New York's storied five families, offering the government everything he had ever known. His name was Joseph Massino. For 13 years, he had run the Bonanno organization with a discipline so complete that federal agents called him the last of the old-time gangsters. He had built his fortune from a lunch truck. He had ordered killings the way other men signed off on invoices. He had watched from close range as his own brother-in-law and underboss decided to save himself by testifying against him. And in the years before all of that, when he was young and rising and full of ambition, one of his closest friends and allies had been a fellow truck hijacker from Queens who would go on to become the most famous mobster in American history, John Gotti. The two men had once eaten together constantly, celebrated together, killed together, and backed each other's rise through an organization that valued loyalty above nearly everything else. And then the loyalty curdled. Gotti's fame became a liability that nearly cost Massino everything, and Massino came to believe that the friend who once helped make him would later conspire to have him killed. Massino outlived Gotti by more than 2 decades and outlasted him in another way too. While Gotti died in prison, still playing the part of the untouchable Don, Massino ended his career the way almost no boss ever had, on a witness stand, dismantling the very organization he had spent a lifetime building. What makes the story worth telling is not simply the betrayal itself, since organized crime in America is built from betrayals the way a house is built from bricks. It is the completeness of it, the fact that a man who had spent 30 years constructing the most disciplined and secretive criminal organization in New York eventually turned that same discipline without hesitation toward its own destruction. This is a story of how that happened, and of what a Sunday dinner between two ambitious young men in Queens eventually cost everyone who trusted either of them. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. It genuinely is one of the best parts of doing this. And if you want more history like this delivered straight to you, subscribe now. Back to Queens and the two young hijackers who are about to become something much more dangerous than friends. Joseph Charles Massino was born on January 10th, 1943, in New York City, one of three sons of Anthony and Adeline Massino, an Italian-American couple whose roots traced back to Naples. Anthony Massino was himself the son of a Neapolitan immigrant born in Macbeth in 1911, and he later worked in a local laundry and served in the war after his son's birth. The family lived for a time above a store on Grand Avenue before eventually buying a home nearby on Caldwell Avenue, modest steps upward in a blue-collar Italian enclave where organized crime figures were not distant or mysterious but simply part of the everyday texture of the neighborhood, present at the same social clubs, the same bakeries, the same street corners as everyone else. A boy growing up in that particular pocket of Queens in the years after the war did not need to go looking for the world Massino would eventually enter. It was already there, waiting at the edges of ordinary life. Massino was, by his own later account, a juvenile delinquent by the age of 12. At 14, he ran away from home to Florida. He dropped out of Grover Cleveland High School in the 10th grade, and whatever formal education he might have received ended there. The education that replaced it was already underway. He first met his future wife, Josephine Vitale, in 1956 and married her in 1960. The marriage brought him something that would define much of his life in ways he could not have predicted at the time, a brother-in-law named Salvatore Vitale, a young man Massino took under his wing the way an older brother might, a bond that would carry both of them through 3 decades of crime and would eventually, in the cruelest possible fashion, help bring Massino down. The couple had 3 daughters, the first named Adeline after Massino's mother, born in December of 1960. Around the same period Massino grew heavy, eventually approaching 400 pounds at his largest, and the streets gave him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, Big Joey. Even decades later, on a witness stand in front of strangers who had never known him as anything but a defendant, the nickname still fit, a physical constant running through every stage of a life that otherwise changed almost beyond recognition between the lunch wagon years and the federal courtroom. Work came from an uncle's shop in Maspeth, where the young Massino made sandwiches for catering trucks and eventually drove one himself, selling coffee and cakes to laborers at a truck yard in Long Island City. It was an unglamorous beginning, but it put him in daily contact with the kind of low-level criminal economy that fed into something larger. Government witnesses would later testify that Massino used his truck to fence stolen merchandise, cameras, and appliances that vanished from loading platforms and reappeared for sale out of the back of his lunch wagon. By the late 1960s, he was operating as an associate of the Bonanno crime family, and he had assembled a hijacking crew that included Vitale and an associate named Dwayne Leisenheimer. To understand what Massino was climbing toward, it helps to understand what the Bonanno crime family already was by the time he entered it. The organization took its name from Joseph Bonanno, a bootlegger turned boss who had led the family from 1931 until 1965, building alliances with other New York bosses, expanding operations into Arizona and California, and running one of the more secretive and tightly knit of the original five families. Bonanno's own ambitions eventually outpaced what the other families were willing to tolerate. In 1965, believing he had discovered plots against him and suspected of plotting against rival bosses in turn, he went into hiding, and the resulting internal chaos, remembered afterward as the Banana Wars, left the family diminished and divided for years. It was into this weakened, still recovering organization, run in the years afterward by a rotating cast of bosses and acting bosses, that a young Queens hijacker named Joseph Massino would eventually rise. The man who would shape the rest of Massino's career was Philip Rastelli, a Maspeth-based captain in the Bonanno organization, known to his men as Rusty. Massino later admitted, after he began cooperating with the government, that his first killing had come sometime in the 1960s, when he shot dead a Bonanno associate named Tommy Zumo. The killing angered Rastelli, who at the time had no idea Massino was responsible. It was, strangely, one of Rastelli's own nephews who helped smooth the path and brought the young hijacker into his uncle's orbit as a protege, an introduction that could easily have gone the other way entirely had Rastelli ever learned who had actually pulled the trigger on Zumo. Rastelli set Massino up as an operator within what was called the Workmen's Mobile Lunch Association, an organization that functioned as a protection racket for food trucks serving construction sites and rail yards around the city. Massino paid dues in the form of kickbacks, and in exchange he was guaranteed no competition wherever he set up his truck, a modest monopoly that nonetheless generated steady income and, more importantly, taught him how organized crime actually worked at street level, layer by layer, favor by favor. It was a small arrangement, but it taught him something he would carry for the rest of his career, that legitimate-looking businesses made the best possible cover for illegitimate income, and that a man who understood how to blend the two could build something that outlasted the men above him. Rastelli, watching his young protege absorb these lessons quickly and without complaint, began treating him less like an errand runner and more like a man worth grooming for something larger, a mentorship that would carry Massino through the family's most violent decade and eventually place him at its head. By the early 1970s, the world Massino was rising inside of was itself in the middle of a succession crisis. Natale Evola, the Bonanno family's boss, died in 1973. On February 23, 1974, at a meeting of the Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia, held at the Americana Hotel in Manhattan, Rastelli was formally named as Evola's successor. It did not settle matters for long. On April 23, 1976, Rastelli was convicted of extortion, and that August he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. With Rastelli behind bars, a former consigliere and convicted drug trafficker named Carmine Galante seized effective control of the family as an unofficial acting boss. and the Bonanno organization entered a period of internal tension that would not fully resolve for years. It was during this same period, in 1975, that Massino's path crossed decisively with a fellow hijacker from Queens named John Gotti. The two men, close in age and in ambition, had both worked the same world of stolen trucks and fenced goods, and in 1975 Massino and his brother-in-law Vitale took part in the murder of a man named Vito Borelli. Massino would later testify that the killing was carried out primarily by Gotti, acting at the behest of Gambino family power broker Paul Castellano. For Massino, the Borelli killing served as the act that made his bones, the phrase used inside the Mafia for the killing that proved a man's loyalty and cleared his path toward all becoming a fully inducted member. It was a threshold every serious associate eventually had to cross if he wanted to rise past the status of a man who simply did useful work on the family's behalf, and crossing it alongside Gotti and Vitale bound the three men together in a way that ordinary friendship never could have, a shared secret carried quietly for years afterward, the kind of history that made betrayal, when it eventually came, so much more personal than it might have been between strangers. The following year, in 1976, Massino arranged the murder of one of his own hijackers, a man named Joseph Pastore, after having Vitale borrow $9,000 from him on Massino's behalf, a debt that gave Massino leverage and cover for what came next. 2 years later, on June 14, 1977, Massino was formally inducted into the Bonanno crime family, made a soldier alongside a small group of other men including Anthony Sparrow and Joseph Chili, in a ceremony conducted by Galante himself. Massino would later testify to a small but telling detail of the ceremony. Galante asked each inductee, in turn, who the boss of the Bonanno family was. Each man answered you, acknowledging Galante's own claim to the position. Massino, alone among them, answered Rastelli. Galante told him he was technically correct, but added that as of the previous week the position was his. It was a strange, almost comic moment inside a ceremony built entirely around loyalty and hierarchy, and it captured something true about Massino from the very beginning of his made life. He was a man who paid close attention to who actually held power, and who was careful about where he placed his allegiance. That allegiance to Rastelli would soon pay off in the most consequential way available inside the world Massino had entered. Alarmed by Galante's ambitions in the narcotics trade, and by his increasingly open bid for control of the family, the heads of New York's other crime families began building consensus for his removal, a consensus that reportedly included even the retired Bonanno family founder himself. In 1979, Rastelli and Massino sought and received commission approval to have Galante killed. On July 12, 1979, Galante was shot dead by three gunmen at a restaurant in the Bushwick section of Brooklyn. Rastelli, still in prison, took full and undisputed control of the family in the aftermath, and he rewarded Massino's loyalty with a promotion to capo regime, a captain with his own crew. Massino set up his operation out of a storefront called the J&S Cake Social Club, tucked behind a catering business he ran as a legitimate front. He was no longer simply a hijacker who had proven himself with one killing. He was becoming a man other men in the organization needed to take seriously. The years that followed the Galante killing tested whether Massino's rise inside the Bonanno family would hold, and they did so through the most violent internal conflict the organization had experienced in a generation. Even with Rastelli formally in charge, a faction of captains within the family had grown restless, resentful of an absentee boss running things from a prison cell through intermediaries, and increasingly convinced that the family's future belonged to them rather than to Rastelli's chosen circle. Three men led that faction: Alphonse Indelicato, known as Sonny Red, Philip Giacone, known as Phil Lucky, and Dominic Trinchera, known as Big Trin. All three were captains in their own right, and all three had begun making moves that Rastelli's loyalists, Massino chief among them, read as an open challenge to the existing order. Massino did not wait to see how the conflict would resolve itself. Rastelli, still directing family affairs from prison, made clear through intermediaries that the rebel faction had to be eliminated before its momentum became unstoppable, and the task of arranging it fell largely to Massino, who by this point had spent the better part of a decade earning exactly the kind of trust such an assignment required, working alongside two other capos, Dominic Napolitano, known as Sonny Black, and a Sicilian-born captain with ties to the Rizzuto organization in Montreal named Gerlando Schiaccia. Massino arranged a meeting at a Brooklyn social club for May 5th, 1981, ostensibly to resolve the tensions between the factions and broker some kind of peace before the dispute spiraled further. It was, in reality, an ambush, planned with the same patient attention to detail that Massino brought to every other part of his career. Four gunmen, including Vitale and Montreal boss Vito Rizzuto, waited hidden inside a closet. When Trinchera, Giaccone, and Indelicato arrived for the meeting, accompanied by a fourth capo named Frank Lino, the three targeted men were shot to death inside the club. Massino himself moved to stop Indelicato from escaping. Lino, who had not been a marked target, managed to run out the door and survive the massacre entirely. The killings solidified Massino's position within the family, but they came with two complications that would trouble him in different ways for years afterward. The first was Lino's escape, which left a living witness to the ambush loose in the world, a problem Massino solved not through violence, but through persuasion, quickly winning Lino over to his side and keeping him as a loyal ally rather than a liability. The second complication was far more serious. Indelicato's body was discovered on May 28th, only weeks after the killing, and his son, Anthony Indelicato, known as Bruno, made no secret of his desire for revenge. That desire for revenge would collide almost immediately with a problem the family did not yet know it had. Unknown to Napolitano, the man who had helped orchestrate the triple killing, one of his own crew associates, was not who he claimed to be. Between 1976 and 1981, an FBI agent named Joseph Pistone had been living undercover inside the Bonanno organization using the alias Donnie Brasco, an operation that had begun as a planned 6-month assignment and stretched into nearly 5 years. Napolitano, hoping to reward Brasco's apparent loyalty and use him against Bruno Indelicato, assigned his undercover associate the task of killing the dead capo's vengeful son. Shortly after that order was given, the FBI pulled Pistone out of the operation and revealed to the stunned Bonanno leadership that Donnie Brasco had never existed at all. The breach was catastrophic for the family's reputation and for Napolitano's standing within it. He had brought an undercover federal agent deep enough into the organization that the man had nearly been proposed for formal membership, and the consequences fell on him personally. On Rastelli's order, relayed through Massino, Napolitano was summoned to what he was told would be a routine meeting in August of 1981. He went anyway, understanding what was likely to happen, and was thrown down a flight of stairs and shot. According to accounts later given by other mobsters, Napolitano, still alive after the initial violence, asked simply to be finished properly, and was. His hands were later severed, a message intended for anyone else in the organization who might consider shaking hands, literally or otherwise, with an informant. Massino, asked later about the entire Donnie Brasco affair, made a grim private joke to associates about owing Napolitano a kind of receipt for what his carelessness had cost the family. The remark captured something essential about how Massino approached violence throughout his career, not with visible rage, but with the flat, procedural tone of a man closing out a piece of unfinished business. Word of Napolitano's killing spread quickly through the underworld, and it carried a message far beyond the immediate punishment of one careless capo. Every man in the Bonanno organization understood after Napolitano that bringing an outsider close enough to nearly qualify for full membership was not merely an embarrassment, it was a capital offense, regardless of how long a man had served or how much the organization had once trusted him. Massino, still relatively new to his role as a captain in his own right, had proven through the Napolitano killing that he was capable of enforcing that principle without hesitation, even against a fellow capo who had been part of the very ambush that killed the three rival captains only months earlier. The purge did not end with Napolitano. On February 18th, 1982, an associate named Anthony Mira was shot in the head by his own nephew, acting on orders that had passed down through several layers of the organization's hierarchy from a capo named Al Embarato, one more casualty of an organization working methodically to close every door the Donnie Brasco operation had ever opened. With the immediate threats from the Donnie Brasco fallout eliminated, Massino went into hiding in Milford, Pennsylvania, anticipating the indictment he expected would eventually come his way. It arrived in time. On January 16th, 1987, Massino was convicted, alongside Rastelli, of labor racketeering charges connected to the family's truck hijacking operations. A federal prosecutor named Michael Chertoff, describing the arc of Massino's career in his opening statement at trial, likened his rise from truck driver to captain to a real-life version of the classic American success story, though built on an entirely different kind of enterprise. Massino received 10 years, his first significant prison sentence. Rastelli, in declining health, received 12. Throughout the trial, two witnesses, Raymond Ween and the same Joseph Pistone who had once posed as Donnie Brasco, testified against him, but neither could conclusively tie Massino to the murders investigators believed he had ordered. At one point during the proceedings, Massino, apparently unbothered by the seriousness of his own predicament, asked Pistone directly who might eventually play him in a film version of the whole affair. Pistone answered that they would have trouble finding an actor heavy enough for the part, a joke about Massino's considerable size that the courtroom took in stride. It was a small moment, but a telling one, evidence that even facing a decade in federal prison, Massino approached the proceedings with the same flat, unbothered composure he brought to nearly everything else. Massino served his sentence knowing that the organization above him was, for the moment, rudderless in every way that mattered. Rastelli, now deep into his own health decline, could offer guidance only through occasional prison visits and messages relayed by trusted intermediaries, and the family's day-to-day authority effectively passed to whichever capo could hold the loyalty of the most crews at once. Massino, even from behind bars, remained widely regarded as the family's true operating head, a reputation built less on any formal title than on the accumulated weight of everything he had already done to earn it. While Massino served his sentence, his old friend from the hijacking days was undergoing a transformation of his own, and it was a transformation built on principles almost entirely opposite to Massino's own instincts. John Gotti had risen through the Gambino crime family, and in December of 1985, in a killing carried out without commission approval, Gotti's allies gunned down Gambino boss Paul Castellano outside a Manhattan steakhouse, clearing the way for Gotti's own ascension to the top of what was, at the time, the most powerful family in New York. Gotti embraced fame in a way no boss before him ever had. He staged elaborate fireworks displays outside his social club in Ozone Park every 4th of July. He held court for the cameras outside the Ravenite Social Club in Manhattan, dressed in tailored suits, smiling for photographers who had turned him into a tabloid celebrity. The press dubbed him the Teflon Don, and for a while the nickname seemed to fit, since prosecutors kept losing cases against him. Massino had once backed Gotti's rise, supporting his old friend's ambitions during the very period when Gotti was maneuvering to take over the Gambino family, and Gotti had returned the favor, later pushing, unsuccessfully, to get Massino a seat on the commission as the Bonanno family's representative, once Massino had risen to a position of real authority within his own organization. But the friendship that had carried both men up from truck hijacking curdled as their circumstances diverged. Gotti was reportedly furious that Massino had eventually been formally promoted within Bonanno leadership without being consulted about it first, a breach of the kind of protocol that mattered enormously inside organizations built entirely on hierarchy and respect. Massino, for his part, would later testify under oath that he came to believe Gotti had conspired with his own brother-in-law, Salvatore Vitale, in a plot against his life. Two men who had once eaten Sunday dinners together as ambitious young hijackers in Queens had become, by the late 1980s, men who suspected one another of wanting the other dead. The gap between them widened into something almost philosophical. Gotti's Ravenite appearances turned him into a fixture of local news broadcasts, a boss who dressed for the cameras as much as for his own men, and whose 4th of July fireworks in Ozone Park drew neighborhood crowds every year, regardless of what the FBI parked across the street thought about it. His trials became public spectacle, his acquittals treated as folk victories by parts of the city that had come to enjoy watching federal prosecutors lose. Massino watched all of it from a careful distance, never appearing at the Ravenite, never courting a reporter, never allowing a photograph of himself to circulate that might help a jury put a face to an indictment. Years later, a fictionalized version of Massino's own legal predicament would even surface as a passing reference on a popular television drama about a New Jersey crime family, a small sign of how thoroughly the culture had absorbed Gotti's celebrity model of the American gangster, even while Massino himself continued operating in something closer to total anonymity. The two philosophies were not simply different personal styles, they were competing theories about what actually protected a man from the government, and for a long stretch of years, both theories appeared to be working. Gotti believed that celebrity offered a kind of protection, that a boss beloved by the public and photographed constantly by reporters was harder for the government to simply disappear into a courtroom. Massino believed precisely the opposite, and everything in his own career from this point forward would be built around proving that quiet, deliberate invisibility was the safer bet. While Rastelli remained the family's boss in name during his final years, largely from behind bars, Massino, still serving his own sentence, was increasingly regarded as the operation's true operating head. In 1991, Rastelli died of cancer while Massino was still incarcerated for the 1987 conviction. With his mentor gone, and with a commission and a family who had come to see him as the obvious successor, Massino gave the order, relayed through Vitale, that made his intentions plain. If Rastelli died, Vitale was to make sure Massino became boss. Massino was released from federal custody on November 13th, 1992, and stepped into an organization that desperately needed rebuilding. The Bonanno family had spent more than a decade as the weakest of New York's 5 families, expelled from the ruling commission after the Donnie Brasco infiltration had exposed just how thoroughly compromised its internal security had become. Massino, now 48 years old and fully aware he might have decades left to run things if he played his hand carefully, set out to avoid every mistake he had watched sink other bosses, Gotti chief among them. His methods were, in almost every respect, the inverse of his old friends. Where Gotti staged fireworks for the cameras, Massino closed down the family's remaining social clubs entirely, understanding them as the single easiest place for federal agents to plant listening devices and build a case. He forbade his men from ever saying his name aloud, instructing them instead to simply touch an ear when they needed to refer to him, a precaution he had reportedly borrowed from watching how carefully Genovese boss Vincent Gigante protected himself from wiretaps. He restructured the family into a cell system, forbidding crews from communicating directly with one another and inserting a layer of intermediaries between himself and the men doing the actual work, a structure explicitly designed to make it far harder for any single informant to map the organization's true chain of command. Because of restrictions on associating with convicted felons during his period of supervised release, he named Vitale, his brother-in-law, as his official messenger, reasoning correctly that the FBI would have no obvious grounds for suspicion about 2 men, related by marriage, spending time together. Vitale himself had never been convicted of a mafia-related offense at that point, despite the Bureau's long-standing suspicion that he was already a made member, which meant the arrangement carried an additional layer of protection Massino could not have replicated with almost any other man in the organization. It was a small piece of legal engineering built entirely around a family tie, and it worked exactly as intended for the better part of a decade. He returned to a job at King Caterers on Long Island, and in 1996 became a co-owner of a well-reviewed Italian restaurant in Mazpeth called Casablanca, where the walls carried photographs of the celebrities who had visited, Johnny Depp among them, an unintentional irony given that Depp had played the undercover agent whose infiltration of the Bonanno family Massino had spent years cleaning up after. Photographs of Hugh Grant and James Caan hung near depths, part of a decor built around Sicilian kitsch, plastic flowers, and bronze-tinted mirrors with the theme from the film The Godfather playing quietly over the sound system some nights. Investigators later found small metal boxes mounted on the restaurant's ceiling, rubber knob devices believed to be intended for detecting electronic surveillance, hanging directly above the round table where Massino and his closest men gathered most evenings. Retired agents who spent years watching him from the outside came to speak of him with a kind of grudging professional respect. One described him simply as extremely smart and very cautious. Another, a supervisor who had tailed him for more than a decade, put it more bluntly, saying that everybody on both sides of the law understood exactly who was in charge, even if no courtroom could yet prove it. Massino filed his taxes on time and declared legitimate income as high as $500,000 in some years, a level of discipline about paperwork that startled agents who had spent careers chasing men far less careful. He shed his affiliation with the family's original name entirely at one point, privately telling his men to consider themselves part of an organization now bearing his own surname rather than Bonanno's, a decision reportedly connected to his anger at the family's original founder for publishing a memoir years earlier that Massino considered a betrayal of the code of silence every made man was supposed to honor for life. The renaming never caught on outside the family itself, and to the wider world, and eventually to the government that indicted him, it remained the Bonanno crime family to the end. The business empire that funded all of this discipline reached far beyond the lunch trucks and hijacked trailers of Massino's early career. Crews under his authority extorted payments from construction unions across New York City, controlling access to no-bid contracts and phantom jobs that produced millions of dollars a year with almost no visible labor behind them. Associates worked their way into New York's Department of Buildings, using corrupted access to city, permitting to steer favorable arrangements toward contractors aligned with the family. In Manhattan's garment district, manufacturers and trucking firms paid weekly sums for what the family called labor peace, a euphemism for the simple guarantee that operations would not be disrupted by strikes, vandalism, or worse. The family also revived a long-standing mafia racket in the private sanitation business, dominating waste hauling across parts of the city by extorting carting companies into fixing prices and eliminating competitors who refused to cooperate. None of it generated headlines the way Gotti's court appearances did. That was, by design, exactly the point. He created a clandestine cell system for his crews, forbidding them from contacting one another and avoiding meeting their own capos directly. In place of the traditional chain of command, where a boss met regularly with the men beneath him, Massino built a rotating committee of trusted intermediaries whose sole function was to carry his orders down to the crews and carry information back up to him, a structure that meant no single captain, and certainly no single associate, ever had a complete picture of who reported to whom or how a given order had originated. A soldier could be told to carry out a piece of business without ever learning that the instruction had come from Massino at all, and a federal wiretap that managed to capture one committee member's conversation would still fall well short of reaching the man actually giving the orders. It was, in effect, the same insulation principle that had once protected Vito Genovese's own successor in a rival family, translated into Massino's own idiom of catering trucks and card tables rather than psychiatric wards and torn bathrobes. Under this new discipline, the family did more than survive. It thrived. The number of made men and captains grew from roughly 80 in the early 1990s to around 110 by the year 2000, achieved through a slower, more careful vetting process than the family had used in decades. The Bonanno organization regained its seat on the commission and, by some assessments, became the second most powerful crime family in New York, trailing only the Genovese organization in overall strength. And through all of it, Massino himself remained almost entirely invisible to the public. The other four New York families had by this point each lost their leadership to the same federal machinery Massino was working so carefully to avoid. Gotti himself had been convicted in 1992 and sent away for life after his own underboss turned informant against him, the very outcome Massino had watched with private satisfaction, given how thoroughly it validated his own approach. Vincent Gigante of the Genovese family, after feigning mental incompetence for the better part of 2 decades, was finally convicted in 1997. The Lucchese and Colombo families had each been gutted by their own internal wars and racketeering prosecutions across the same stretch of years. Massino alone, among the heads of the 5 families, remained free, running his organization from a restaurant table in Maspeth, while his counterparts sat in federal facilities across the country. By the early 2000s, journalists had taken to calling him the Last Don, the only reigning boss of a major New York family who was not, at that moment, behind bars, a distinction that made him, however quietly, the single most powerful man remaining in New York's organized crime landscape. The FBI's own Bonanno squad had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to close the gap between what agents knew and what they could prove. Retired supervisors who had tracked Massino for years came to know his habits and his caution better than almost anyone outside his own family, and the agents who inherited the case after them inherited an adversary who had already absorbed every previous lesson the Bureau had taught the rest of the underworld through its long pursuit of Gotti and Gigante before him. The head of the squad by the early 2000s would later note that agents assigned to Massino's case understood they were watching not a reckless celebrity boss, but a patient student of the government's own methods, a man who had spent 2 decades studying exactly how other bosses had been caught in order to make certain none of the same mistakes would ever be made against him. Even Vitale, the brother-in-law Massino had raised up through the organization and leaned on constantly as his messenger and go-between, found his position quietly reduced as Massino's cell system took hold. The new structure stripped Vitale of much of the underboss's traditional role as intermediary between the boss and the rest of the family, along with the share of the family's earnings. That role had always carried with it, and Massino made little effort to hide from Vitale that his growing unpopularity among the other captains was part of the reason for the change. Vitale would later describe himself, in his own words to investigators, as having been reduced to little more than a figurehead. He stayed loyal anyway, at least for the moment, and even helped Massino plan one of the family's most consequential killings of the decade. On March 18, 1999, Gerlando Schiaccia, the same Sicilian-born captain who had helped arrange the 1981 ambush of the 3 rival capos, was shot dead, his body left in a street in the Bronx rather than hidden or buried, a choice meant to make the killing look like the aftermath of a failed drug transaction rather than an authorized mafia hit. Massino gave different men different reasons for the killing over the years. To some associates at the time, he suggested Schiaccia had been targeted for feuding with a trusted capo he accused of using cocaine. Under oath years later, he offered a different account entirely, tying the motive back to an earlier killing involving another mobster's son. Whatever the true reason, Massino took care to send his own capos to Schiaccia's funeral, preserving appearances even as the family quietly closed the book on one of its own senior men. Around this same period, on Massino's orders and with Vitale again handling the arrangements, an associate named Gabriele Infanti, who had years earlier botched an assigned hit and was suspected by the family of cooperating with investigators, was also killed and disposed of. One more loose thread tied off in an organization that treated internal suspicion as reason enough for a death sentence. It could not last, and the forces that eventually broke it apart came from exactly the place organizational theory would have predicted. The men closest to Massino, the ones who understood the operation well enough to hurt it badly if their own self-interest ever came into conflict with their loyalty to him. The first crack appeared with a capo named Frank Coppa, already serving time on unrelated securities fraud charges, who was indicted again in October of 2002 and chose, rather than face what amounted to a life sentence stacked on top of his existing one, to become the first made member in the entire documented history of the Bonanno crime family to cooperate with the government. Coppa's decision to talk exposed others around him. Richard Cantarella, who had served as acting underboss in 2001 and 2002, and who Coppa's testimony implicated an earlier killing, turned informant himself in December of 2002 rather than face racketeering and murder charges of his own. A third man, Joseph D'Amico, followed shortly afterward, aware that Cantarella's cooperation left him exposed to murder charges as well. What made these defections so damaging was not simply their number, but their proximity to Massino's own inner circle. Coppa, Cantarella, and D'Amico were not peripheral associates who had drifted through the organization's outer edges. They were men who had sat inside the same meetings, handled the same money, and understood the same chain of command that Massino had spent over a decade working to keep hidden from outside view. Each one, faced with the mathematics of a potential life sentence against the alternative of cooperation, made the same calculation in turn, and each calculation exposed the next man down the line to the same impossible choice. It was the precise failure mode that Massino's cell system had been designed to prevent. Informants working their way inward from crew to crew, except that here the informants were not outsiders, penetrating the organization the way Joseph Pistone once had. They were made men who had simply decided, one after another, that loyalty no longer served their own interests. Each defection weakened the wall of secrecy Massino had spent more than a decade constructing, and by early 2003, federal prosecutors judged they finally had enough to move against the boss himself. On the morning of January 9th, 2003, federal agents arrived at Massino's home in Howard Beach to take him into custody. His wife of more than 4 decades, Josephine, still dressed in her pajamas and housecoat, could do little but watch in silence as her husband was led out of the house he had spent 30 years building around her. Massino was arrested and charged in a comprehensive racketeering indictment alongside Vitale, Capo Frank Lino, the same man who had once escaped the 1981 massacre with his life, and another capo named Daniel Mungeli. The charges reached back across more than 2 decades of Massino's career and prominently included the 1981 killing of Dominic Napolitano, the Sonny Black, whose failure to detect Donnie Brasco had cost him his own life. Massino was denied bail, and in his enforced absence, a capo named Vincent Basciano, known within the organization as Vinny Gorgeous for his fondness for tailored suits and his ownership of a Bronx beauty salon called Hello Gorgeous, stepped up to serve as the family's acting boss. Basciano was a far more volatile figure than Massino had ever been, quick-tempered and openly ambitious in a way that stood in sharp contrast to the studied patience Massino had spent 30 years cultivating, and he would soon become central to the final chapter of Massino's story in a way nobody could have predicted at the time. The trial that followed began on May 24, 2004, in federal court in Brooklyn, in a case styled the United States of America versus Joseph Massino and others, presided over by Judge Nicholas Garalfis. It was, by any measure, the most significant organized crime prosecution to reach a New York courtroom since the case that had finally brought down Vincent Gigante in 1997. 8 cooperating witnesses testified against Massino over the course of the trial, but one loomed over the proceedings in a way none of the others could match. Salvatore Vitale, Massino's brother-in-law and underboss, the same man Massino had taken under his wing as a young hijacker decades earlier, had also been arrested, and he too had chosen cooperation over the alternative. For nearly a week, the 2 men who had once been closer than most brothers sat in the same Brooklyn courtroom while Vitale, in careful and methodical detail, described their shared history of crime, walking the jury through killings that included the 1981 massacre of the 3 rival capos. Massino's wife, Josephine, sat in the courtroom throughout her brother's testimony, refusing to rise when the judge and Vitale entered the room together, and making her contempt for her own brother visible to everyone present. Vitale's testimony carried a weight none of the other cooperating witnesses could match, precisely because of how close he had been to Massino for so long. He walked the jury through their shared history in painstaking chronological order, and at one point described how his own 2001 arrest had chilled the relationship between the 2 men, telling jurors that in the aftermath, no one from Massino's side had so much as called his wife and children to ask whether they needed anything. It was a small domestic detail buried inside a murder trial, but it captured something true about how thoroughly the organization's logic of self interest could hollow out even the closest family ties. Massino's own defense team, aware of how damaging Vitale's account had been, called only a single witness in response, an FBI agent brought in solely to challenge the reliability of Vitale's memory and motives, a thin rebuttal against testimony that covered more than 3 decades of documented crime. On July 30th, 2004, the jury returned its verdict after 5 days of deliberation. Massino was convicted on all 11 counts of the racketeering indictment, including racketeering conspiracy, extortion, arson, money laundering, and 7 separate murders carried out in aid of racketeering. His daughter Adeline, present in the courtroom, was heard reacting with quiet disbelief as the verdicts were read one after another. It was, on its face, the end of the story, the final chapter in the long and violent career of a man who had spent 30 years building an organization specifically designed to prevent this exact outcome. But Massino was not finished, and what happened next would prove far stranger and far more consequential for organized crime in New York than the conviction itself. Massino still faced a second trial, one that carried a threat no conviction alone had presented: the death penalty. The charge stemmed from the 1999 killing of Gerlando Sciascia, known within the organization as George from Canada, the same captain who had helped Massino orchestrate the massacre of the 3 rival capos nearly 2 decades earlier. One of the final acts of Attorney General John Ashcroft's tenure had been to order federal prosecutors to pursue capital punishment against Massino for that killing, a decision that would have made him the first mafia boss sentenced to death since Louis Buchalter, known as Lepke, was executed in 1944. Facing that prospect, Massino did something that stunned even the prosecutors who had spent years building the case against him. Almost immediately after the guilty verdict was read in his racketeering trial, before court had even fully adjourned, Massino requested a private meeting with Judge Garaufis and made his first offer to cooperate with the government. By late September of 2004, the arrangement had been formalized. Massino, the man who had built the most disciplined secrecy apparatus of any New York crime family in a generation, agreed to become a government informant, and his very first assignment demonstrated exactly how far he was prepared to go. He agreed to wear a hidden recording device inside a federal prison and secretly tape his own conversations with Vincent Basciano, the acting boss who had stepped into his old position while Massino sat in custody awaiting trial. The recordings that followed were remarkable, both for what they captured and for the almost absurd texture of the conversations themselves. Massino reported to investigators that Basciano had discussed a plot to kill a federal prosecutor named Greg Andres, and after Massino failed a polygraph examination regarding the details of that conversation, he agreed to wear a wire during subsequent jailhouse meetings with Basciano to nail down exactly what had been discussed. He never managed to extract an unambiguous confession from Basciano regarding the plot against Andres, but the recordings did capture Basciano freely admitting to ordering the murder of an associate named Randolph Pizzolo, evidence that would prove decisive years later. At times during these recorded conversations, prosecutors would later note, Massino found himself patiently explaining basic elements of mob terminology and procedure to Basciano as though instructing a student, a strange echo of his own decades spent learning that same vocabulary from men like Rastelli. Massino's cooperation extended well beyond the recordings. Acting on information he provided, the FBI returned in the fall of 2004 to a burial site in Queens that investigators had come to refer to informally as the Mob Graveyard, where the body of Alphonse Indelicato had first been discovered back in 1981. Guided by Massino's account of the 1981 massacre, agents unearthed the remains of Philip Giacone and Dominic Trinchera as well, finally giving both men's families a resting place to bury more than 2 decades after their deaths. The 3 men had died together in the same room on the same night, and for 23 years only one of their bodies had ever been recovered. The same man who had planned their killing was, in the end, the one who told investigators exactly where to dig for the other two, closing a circle that had opened on a single violent evening in a Brooklyn social club decades earlier. Investigators also hoped Massino's information might lead them to two other long missing bodies connected to organized crime violence from the same era, but on those searches, the record simply goes cold. No documentation confirms that either body was ever located. Word of what Massino was doing eventually broke publicly in January of 2005, and the news landed inside organized crime circles with the force of an earthquake. Men who had spent their entire careers operating on the assumption that a boss, whatever else he might do, would never personally wear a recording device against his own successor, now had to reckon with the fact that the single most disciplined secrecy apparatus any New York family had ever built had been dismantled from the inside by the very man who designed it. Vitale, who had testified against Massino at his own trial the previous summer, and who by now had admitted to 11 murders across his own 30 years in the organization, would eventually be rewarded for his cooperation as well. In October of 2010, after years of debriefings, he was sentenced to time served and entered the federal witness protection program himself, the underboss and the boss who had once been closer than most brothers, ending up in the end on precisely the same side of the courtroom, testifying against the same organization they had spent decades building together. By February of 2005, Massino had been confirmed as the source behind the graveyard discovery, and by May, the Justice Department formally withdrew its threat to seek the death penalty against him in the Sciascia case. On June 23, 2005, Massino appeared before Judge Garaufis one final time and pleaded guilty to ordering Sciascia's murder, closing out the eighth and final killing attributed to him. Drawn in gray, speaking in barely more than a whisper, he told the judge that as boss of the Bonanno crime family, he had given the order, and confirmed for the record that the order had been to kill the man his own men had known only as George from Canada. For his original 2004 conviction in this new guilty plea, Garaufis sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms, a sentence that, absent his cooperation, carried no realistic path toward freedom. As part of the same proceeding, Josephine Massino negotiated a forfeiture settlement that allowed her and Massino's elderly mother to keep their homes, while the family surrendered $9 million in assets to the government, including the Casablanca restaurant and 2 cafes the family had operated on the Fresh Pond Road. Separately, agents recovered $7 million in cash Massino had hidden inside the attic of his Howard Beach home, along with hundreds of gold bars concealed within his restaurant, all of it turned over as part of the broader settlement. What Massino had done was, by any honest measure, unprecedented. No sitting or former boss of a New York crime family had ever fully cooperated with federal prosecutors before, and the shockwaves moved through organized crime circles almost immediately. Over the following 2 years, in 2006 and 2007, Massino testified in a series of trials against former Bonanno soldiers, describing killings dating back decades in painstaking detail. His testimony helped convict soldiers named Baldassare Amato and Anthony Locurto in a racketeering conspiracy case that reached back to the 1981 murder of an associate named Joseph Pladia, and he walked juries through the elaborate cleanup operations the family had used over the years, the chain of approvals a killing required before it could be carried out, and the crews assigned specifically to make bodies disappear once the killing itself was finished. Vitale, for his own part, entered more than 100 separate debriefing sessions with federal investigators, helping prosecutors map the roles of more than 500 members and associates across the wider organization. Frank Lino, the capo who had once run out the door of a Brooklyn social club and survived the very massacre Massino had orchestrated against his fellow captains, followed the same path as almost everyone else who had once stood closest to Massino. Arrested alongside him in the original 2003 indictment, Lino too became a cooperating witness rather than face trial on his own, closing out, in the most literal way possible, the story of a man who had escaped one attempt on his life inside the organization only to end it decades later, testifying against the very boss who had spared him. Prosecutors would later credit his cooperation, layered on top of Massino's, with contributing to more than 50 additional convictions of Bonanno figures, part of a broader campaign that by the end of the decade had produced roughly 135 convictions of family members and associates altogether. Each appearance chipped away further at whatever remained of the organization Massino had spent 13 years rebuilding, and each one made plain that the man once celebrated as the last of the old school bosses had become the single greatest threat the Bonanno family had ever faced. The most consequential of these appearances came in April of 2011, when Massino took the stand during the death penalty phase of Vincent Basciano's federal murder and racketeering trial, the same Basciano he had once recorded from inside a prison cell. Dressed in a plain tracksuit, seated beside Judge Garaufis in the Brooklyn courtroom, Massino spent hours describing his own criminal history and the operational logic of the organization he had once controlled, at one point comparing the way a functioning crime family blended different kinds of men and skills to the way a good sauce required many different ingredients working together. He explained, patiently and in detail for a jury that had never lived inside that world, the ear-touching gesture his men had once used instead of speaking his name, the same precaution he had adopted years earlier out of respect for what he had watched Vincent Gigante accomplish through a very different kind of disguise. Prosecutors played portions of the actual recorded conversations for the jury, letting them hear, in Massino and Basciano's own voices, the casual, almost bureaucratic tone in which men discussed the murder as a simple matter of business. Basciano was convicted of ordering the killing of Randolph Pizzolo, one of the murders those recordings had helped establish beyond dispute, and the jury spared him the death penalty he had faced going into the trial, leaving him instead to serve out a second life sentence on top of one he was already serving from an earlier conviction, the same man who had once run the Bonanno family from a jail cell now destined never to leave federal custody at all. By June of 2013, with his health declining under the weight of diabetes and years of accumulated strain, Massino appeared before Garaufis one final time. Prosecutors, citing the extraordinary scope of his cooperation, asked the judge to resentence him to time served with supervised release for the remainder of his life. Garaufis agreed. Massino, 70 years old by then, thanked the judge and said he prayed every night for the people he had hurt and for their families. It was not until that same year, 2013, that the Bonanno organization formally recognized a new boss in Massino's place, Michael Mancuso, who had himself replaced Basciano as acting boss once Basciano's own convictions removed him from the picture entirely. It was a strangely quiet, formal ending for an organization that had spent more than a decade without any clear leadership at all, its last uncontested boss having spent those same years testifying against it from behind a wall of federal protection rather than running it from behind a restaurant counter in Masbeth. Massino spent his final years living under a new identity through the Federal Witness Protection Program, relocated to Ohio, where he reportedly went by the name Ralph Rogers and settled into an unremarkable life that included, according to later reporting, regular visits to local casinos and a habit of attending church daily. He died on September 14th, 2023, at a rehabilitation facility in Glen Cove on Long Island at the age of 80, following a short illness compounded by the diabetes and obesity that had troubled him for years. His funeral was a private affair attended only by family, and the location of his burial was kept undisclosed, a final, quiet measure of the same instinct for concealment that had defined nearly every decision of his adult life. Josephine, the wife who had once refused to stand when her own brother entered a Brooklyn courtroom to testify against her husband, remained married to Massino through all of it, through the conviction, the cooperation, and the decades of exile that followed, keeping the home the forfeiture settlement had allowed her to save even after the man she had married in 1960 had become, in the eyes of the organization he once led, the single most despised traitor in its history. The organization Massino once ran continued on without him in the years that followed, passing through a succession of bosses and acting bosses far less powerful than he had ever been, a family permanently diminished by the very prosecutions his cooperation had helped drive. By the middle of the 2020s, leadership of what the government and the press still called the Bonanno crime family had settled on Michael Mancuso, a Bronx native whose own father had been a Lucchese family soldier, murdered in a bar when Mancuso was a boy, a reminder that the world Massino had spent his life navigating never stopped producing the same kind of violence, even after the man who had once ruled it most completely was gone from the streets entirely. Massino's own era overlapped almost exactly with two other bosses who represented entirely different answers to the same basic problem of how a man survives at the top of an American crime family. While Gotti performed fame outside the Ravenite and Massino performed almost total invisibility from behind the counters of a Macbeth restaurant, Vincent Gigante, boss of the far larger and wealthier Genovese crime family, performed something stranger still, shuffling through the streets of Greenwich Village in a torn bathrobe for decades, feigning mental incompetence so convincingly that it delayed his own trial for the better part of a decade. Three bosses, three philosophies of concealment and exposure, running simultaneously in the same city, each convinced his own method offered the surest path to survival. Gotti's fame collapsed under its own weight. Gigante's performance eventually collapsed too, under the accumulated testimony of men who had sat across from him at meetings and knew perfectly well he was never anything but lucid. Massino's invisibility held longer than either of the other two models, for the simple reason that the government could not easily build a public case against a man the public had never heard of. What finally broke his defense was not surveillance, not celebrity, not a courtroom competency battle, but the plainest and oldest vulnerability of all, the men closest to him deciding, one after another, that their own survival mattered more than his. John Gotti did not live to see any of it. He had died in prison in June of 2002, still the Teflon Don in the public imagination even as cancer, and a federal conviction had long since stripped away the invincibility his celebrity once seemed to guarantee. The two men who had once eaten Sunday dinners together as young hijackers in Queens, who had backed each other's rise inside an organization that prized loyalty above nearly every other virtue, ended up on opposite sides of one of the starkest lessons organized crime in America ever produced. Gotti chose visibility, believing that fame and public adoration offered their own kind of armor, and the armor failed him completely. The government convicted him, and the celebrity that once protected him became, in the end, simply the reason everyone remembered exactly how it happened. Massino chose the opposite path entirely: discipline, invisibility, and a level of operational secrecy that kept him out of prison and at the top of his organization for longer than almost any of his contemporaries. And then, when that discipline finally failed him too, he did something Gotti never could have imagined doing. He turned the same careful procedural mind that had once run an entire criminal enterprise toward tearing that enterprise apart from the inside, one recorded conversation and one careful piece of testimony at a time. What the story of Joseph Massino ultimately reveals is not simply the fall of one more crime boss, a pattern American history had already seen many times before he ever rose to power. It is a story about the limits of loyalty as an organizing principle for any human enterprise, criminal or otherwise, and about how thin the line can be between a man who is protected by the people closest to him and a man who is eventually destroyed by them. Massino spent his career building walls specifically designed to survive exactly the kind of betrayal that eventually broke him, walls made of silence, secrecy, and an almost obsessive attention to who around him could and could not be trusted. In the end, his own brother-in-law testified against him in open court, and Massino himself, facing the same choice every man in his position eventually faces, chose survival over the code he had spent 30 years enforcing on everyone else. None of the men who once sat with him at that round table in Macbeth beneath the ceiling boxes meant to catch a listening device ever imagined the final threat to the organization would come from the boss himself, wearing a wire of his own inside a federal prison cell. That is, in the end, the detail the whole story turns on. The code itself did not survive him either. at least not in the form the old-timers who had raised Massino would have recognized. Omerta, the vow of silence that Massino himself had spent an entire career enforcing on other men without mercy, had already been cracking for decades by the time he faced his own choice, worn down steadily by one cooperating witness after another across every one of New York's 5 families. What Massino added to that slow erosion was not simply one more name on a long list of informants. It was proof that even the very top of the hierarchy, the position every rule and every killing had supposedly existed to protect, offered no real immunity once a man's own survival came into conflict with the organization's. The friendship that began over Sunday meals with John Gotti, 2 ambitious young men from Queens who believed loyalty would carry them both to the top, ended instead as a case study in exactly how far each of them was ultimately willing to go once loyalty stopped serving their own interests. Neither man, in the end, was who he first appeared to be at that table, back when the friendship still looked like nothing more than 2 young men from Queens sharing a Sunday meal. And the record of what they actually did, once the plates were finally cleared and the real business began, is the only version of the story that survives.